Hello and welcome to Straight Talk with me, Sifiso Mahlangu. We're live tonight. It is 7 p.m. This is ANN7, channel 405 on DSTV. It's 2018 and we want to wish South Africa a blessed year indeed. The matric results have just come out. Free education is the talking point in this country. I have with me on Straight Talk on the hot seat tonight, Mr. Maurice Masuta. Mr. Masuta is considered the poster boy or the unofficial spokesperson of free education in this country. Is it feasible? Will it last? And all the talking points. Don't move. This is Straight Talk with me, Sifiso Mahlangu. Mr. Masuta, I welcome you to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Happy New Year. The matric results have just come out. And the talking point in this country is free, decolonized education. You've been very vocal on the theme of free education. Just for the benefit of my viewers, maybe give us some background and why you're so vocal on the concept of free education.
Yeah, I think before we start, it's best to correct my identity. I think the identification of myself as a spokesperson of free education of anything is unjustifiably pompous and an insult to students who have either been kicked out of university, persecuted, thrown in jail or arrested for fighting for free education while I was not even in the country. I'm just a researcher who has been contributing opinion pieces and presented to the Fees Commission on the matter. So I think my identity can just be reduced to that and not to anything else beyond that. But I've been a lot more vocal on free higher education since I set foot in Gauteng, which was in 2007 as a student. I had the privilege of participating in SASCO, SRC, and eventually found myself studying higher education related matters at university. That's how I find myself participating. Largely because higher education here in South Africa and around the world has in many ways been used to reproduce social inequality and legitimize domination of one class by another. And I felt strongly when I entered the field that there was a need for somebody to ask a bit more difficult questions and challenge the status quo that continues to become a proxy of societal class exploitation. So I have not narrowed issues of higher education policy to what's happening at university. In fact, my approach as an economic geographer comes from society into universities and not the other way around. And there are many ways in which, many reasons why one would want to be involved in challenging the currently commodified form of higher education that exists here and many other parts of the world. But in South Africa in particular, you would remember that education was used in many ways to oppress people. But in post-1994, higher education was identified as a strategic tool to break the cycle of poverty and undo the legacy of apartheid, which has polarized South Africa into one of the most unequal societies in the world. However, a post-1994 neoliberal approach to education has underpinned the continued commodification of higher education into a commodity that must be bought and sold, with much of the cost transferred to students. And I think it is that particular commodification of higher education which has been legitimized in many ways that underpinned the higher education funding crisis that gripped the country. That would be, say, a background that I believe led to much of the crisis. And there are a number of realities that then, material things that I can point to, which I believe led to the crisis inside our universities across the country.
Many of the articles I've read about you and your work seem to lead with the writings that you are President Jacob Zuma's son-in-law, or you will be in future. Just for the record, are you intending to be President Jacob Zuma's son-in-law?
Firstly, no, I'm not. But two, I don't think there's even an English word called future son-in-law. You can't see someone in the street and say, "Hey, I like that girl. That's my future." I think it suggests
that you've got
future girlfriend.
To marry in the Zuma clan.
Yeah. No, but nobody becomes anybody's future son in anything because they have plans of anything. There's a process that happens. I'm not engaged to anybody, and I largely prefer to focus on the substance of why free education is critical and not peripheral things which are meant to distract people from the real things. But for your information, no. Fake news has become synonymous with mainstream media. And I think we have corrected that part. But I also don't think South Africans are interested in such things, but rather how free education will be implemented, why it must be implemented, and that it must happen smoothly over the next few weeks. Yeah, I think that is probably
Let's talk about the feasibility of free education in this country and how it will affect our fiscus. Do you think South Africa can afford it? I know the latter discussion is whether we can or not, we must attempt it, because it was the promise of the African National Congress. It was an indication from the Freedom Charter. So free decolonized education is something we owe our children. And I think that's a significant narrative. But can South Africa afford free education?
Okay. Let's start by saying that the higher education funding crisis presents one of the most urgent threats to South Africa's socio-economic stability and its people's path to some form of dignity and collective social mobility. Let's also maybe help remind viewers that there have been at least 5 reports investigating the feasibility of rolling out free higher education in South Africa, particularly for the poor and the working class. So it's not a new discussion. The 2012 report said so. The 2011 Ministerial Review report on NSFAS said so. And subsequent reports indicated how higher education, free higher education for poor and working class students is feasible. Right? So it's not a new discussion and definitely not my discussion. Let's just start there. But I think the mistake that has been made is to reduce the concept of feasibility to affordability. They are not the same thing. You could even say affordability is a sub-theme of feasibility. Affordability is a function of one's possession of specific resources in relation to that which you are trying to buy. But higher education is not a cost. It is an investment with well-known financial, economic, political, and cultural returns. And all countries in the world that continue to have an improved social mobility amongst its population, all countries in the world that have a strong industrial base, all countries in the world with lesser levels of inequality have actually prioritized education and made it accessible to all its citizens, regardless of class. But those countries have particularly protected the marginalized, which is what has happened in South Africa. So the feasibility at an international level, there's literature to prove that. The second thing, however, is that if you want to narrow it down to rands and cents, you need to look at higher education as a societal matter. And how you do that is that, number one, you would then say, out of the overall purse that South Africa has, where is money going? South Africa is currently carrying a social welfare monstrosity. That is, you have such a huge amount of people who are dependent on social welfare, primarily because they are economically inactive. Economically inactive primarily because they haven't been skilled and therefore absorbed into either work or entrepreneurial endeavors. So as a result of that, a big chunk of what we make as a country goes in trying to assist those people to just make ends meet, to survive. So a huge dependency syndrome pierces through South Africa day in, day out. Now, fortunately, when you look at the unemployment rate, you realize that it's very high amongst youth who have neither completed matric nor even entered university. However, unemployment amongst young graduates is as low as 5%, which means there's a strong bond between a post-higher education qualification and one's chances at becoming economically active, or in other words, becoming employed. Now, the math will tell you that for every graduate that you produce, you save in a lifetime of social grants for that person and his kids.
RDPs and
you save in a lifetime of free public health care in many ways. You save in a lifetime of free houses. In other words, free higher education or skilling your nation disqualifies a significant portion of your population from depending on your social welfare net. And as a result, you have a country of 55 million people with, I think, income taxpayers of around 6 million. So if you want more money, what do? You increase your tax base. So you educate and skill individuals to become economically active so that you increase your tax base, tax them, increase your revenue levels, and contribute. That's why we say free education funds itself. But importantly, people are saying your economy is low. It has gone low. Growth rates are very low. There's very little foreign direct investment coming in. The question they don't ask is, why aren't investors coming to South Africa? Most investors are not coming to South Africa, amongst other reasons, because it's expensive to invest in South Africa. To set up a factory, you must first come and skill a bunch of people. So skilling your nation attracts investment and therefore increases your revenue and grows your economy. So there are many ways in which free higher education is actually a logical economic step in a struggling economy. But importantly, as you know, as you correctly stated, this is a social bond between the ruling party and its electorate. This is a policy position, this is a manifesto promise, and this is an apex priority of government. Now, you name something an apex priority for one reason. You are saying, when I'm down and out, this is the one thing I can't compromise. So when you are down and out revenue-wise, the education of your children is not something you are willing to compromise. And we could go on and on about the economics of free higher education, but essentially, an apex priority is identified not for fun, primarily because it is one of the engines of the regeneration of this economy and this society in its entirety.
Let's talk about the actualization of free education. The EFF said they would be at the gates of universities to make sure that students are admitted. However, many institutions, Witwatersrand, the University of Johannesburg, have released statements to say there will be no walk-ins in 2018. So how is this going to work, Mr. Masuta? What is the actualization of this free education for a student who's watching Straight Talk and considering to go to this university? Is it going to be a tumultuous event where, you know, there'll be rubber bullets and tear gas, or is there the potential that young black kids may be admitted, even though they did not apply in 2018?
Well, in my humble opinion, I think the EFF statement was misunderstood. I also believe that the EFF could have best explained what they meant. Okay, South Africa is generally it's a country of people who react to things. Each time there's a tweet, it becomes an article, it becomes a TV program. People must start by asking themselves, what walk-in was the EFF referring to? There are three types of walk-ins that could possibly happen in January. It's walk-ins for late application, it's walk-in for registration, and it's walk-in for late registration. What the lead...
walk-in to come and study, walk-in to the classroom.
No. You would have to not have an idea of how a university functions to think that someone can just walk in and say, I'm here to study. What the EFF was referring to, which I think it's something that has been addressed by Minister Mkhize, was that before you announce free education, there were people who knew that they can never make it to university and therefore did not bother to apply. Those people should at least be given an opportunity. And that has been addressed, not only through the Department of Higher Education's clearinghouse, but it's also been addressed as follows. Many universities have received hundreds of thousands of applications, but you will find that a student has 5 acceptance letters from 5 different institutions. The moment that student picks one of the 5 universities, he or she frees up 4 spaces in those respective institutions. And some universities will find it possible to have late applications, either online or in person. Universities with sophisticated online application systems like UJ, VET, and so on, Live VET, UJ in particular, they have a mobile site which you simply catch a taxi to town, you spend 20 rand, and you use your matric results using your ID number to apply for the whatever degree that is remaining. However, the leader of the opposition is correct that there are some universities, for example, like VUT, who might not have that sophisticated online system and might invite late applications in person. So you have a stratified higher education sector. And unless somebody understands it in its granular details, that's why people will make sweeping statements. I don't think the statement of the EFF dramatically incorrect. I also believe that they could have gone into granular details to stipulate that there are certain universities where you can walk in and there are others which you can walk in. Vice chancellors are not helping either, because you have vets writing a statement that we won't allow walk-ins. Since when was there walk-in at vets? There's never been walk-in at vets. Who would walk into Stellenbosch? You can't even walk into the Stellenbosch town, let alone the Stellenbosch University. So let's understand each institution in its individual characterization. We will understand that some institutions have more sophisticated online late application systems and others do not. If they are full, they will release a statement, sorry, we are full, we can't take any more late applications. Free education is a seamless process. It's going to happen smoothly over the next few weeks, and South Africans will appreciate that finally the financial and academic genocide on the poor, which has been the barrier, is officially lifted off their shoulders. Of course, this is just one of many other barriers that Africans will experience when they try to access ivory tower institutions in particular.
Let's talk numbers.
Yeah.
In your estimation, how much will it cost government to fund free education for the year of 2018?
I don't need to estimate anymore, because the Department of Higher Education did mention that to phase in free higher education for poor and working class students who come from households earning between 0 and 350,000 rand in their first year of study will cost 12.4 billion rand.
And not 40 billion rand as Mr. Michael Sachs had estimated.
Look, I've never really heard Michael Sachs say that. The Sunday Times and the ENCA did say that he said that. But I'm not going to become a victim of tertiary information, not even primary. I tried
to contact Mr. Sachs to get his opinion on that, and his response was, why does it matter?
Yeah, it probably doesn't matter because it's false. Yeah. We can't really be reproducing secondary or tertiary information about tertiary institutions. We must use first-hand primary information. And the primary information from the Department of Higher Education is that the overall cost of this matter, of this intervention, including TVETs, including subsidy to universities, is 12.5 billion rand. And I'm waiting for someone to tell me that a country that collects over $1 trillion cannot afford to take its children to school with 12.5 billion rand. We would have a difficult time understanding that narrative.
A subject I'm interested in, Mr. Masuta, is decolonized education. We've covered a bit about free education. Let's talk about decolonized free education. Are you hoping for a system where black kids will be allowed to learn more on their cultures and traditions, on the environmental status that made them black, and perhaps put away the chapters on the Jan van Riebeeck or the colonizers that brought South Africa to where it is today? Are we attempting to go into the direction of free and decolonized education?
Well, I think that the matter of what a decolonized system of higher education ought to look like must be thrown back to the students. I think they deserve time to refine it and develop their own charter. It can't be an opinion of an individual. My 2 cents, however, would be that the field of higher education in South Africa and in many parts of the world enjoy a greater degree of autonomy and hierarchy. In its autonomous nature, higher education is at liberty to generate its own values, to determine its own principles, and most importantly, the cost of the product it's offering. But also the hierarchical nature of the higher education sector means that you've got dominant groups and subordinate groups. Dominant groups deploy their cultural, social, economic, and even financial capitals in order to protect the status quo. But the protection of the dominance in higher education is actually a smokescreen for dominance in society. So the higher education that we are talking about should at least guide us by correctly representing where we are coming from, correctly capturing our presence, and correctly addressing or planning for our future challenges and opportunities. And I think students, as the primary stakeholders of the higher education sector, ought to be given an opportunity to refine it. And I think the Department of Higher Education must lead that discussion with students so that it's not rushed. It can't be an opinion of an individual. it must be a charter that is adopted by all students, in my humble opinion, because at the end of the day, these universities are a microcosm of society that we come from, and therefore they are not some island that exists somewhere and people must be shipped in and out. I know universities are able to commit a lot of atrocities because of the autonomy that they enjoy, but I think that autonomy will begin to be challenged in post-apartheid South Africa by the students, and hence I'm saying they must be given that opportunity. For example, South African universities behave like a monopoly. They behave like mines. You know, they're like a revolving door. You know, a mine can fire 10,000 men and women from the Eastern Cape today, and who are demanding a better pay, and hire 10,000 men and women from Limpopo tomorrow and pay them even less than the ones who just got fired. In South Africa, universities are small, incapacitated, and therefore they don't have to lift a finger for students to come to them. There is a much greater demand for them. As a result, these universities are too comfortable to even start thinking about decolonizing. We need them more than they need us, and they've become a financial or a corporate machinery that selects students according to implicit class categorization, and exclude students according to explicit class categorization, without admitting and in many ways denying the injustice or the inequality that is inherent in patterns of access and success in higher education. So the students must call the shots for once.
It is the Saturday morning of the elective conference, and we received statements from the presidency saying President Jacob Zuma has granted free education in this country. And I remember that months before that, President Jacob Zuma had made an order or a demand or an instruction to the then Finance Minister, Mr. Pravin Gordhan, to say, make the funds available for free education. He made an instruction to the then Minister of Higher Education, Mr. Bladen Nzimande, to say, make sure that free education comes. Why is it that Mr. Nzimande and Mr. Pravin Gordhan didn't facilitate the discussion to the leading to free education?
You see, we must stay free from the politics and keep our eyes on the ball. The ball is that free higher education is here. It must be implemented smoothly, and that's it. President Jacob Zuma announced the South African government's policy position. It's not President Zuma's policy. President Zuma, through the Judicial Commission of Inquiry in Higher Education, announced government's response to the Heha report. So the attempt to individualize it has mainly come from mainstream narratives which are opposed to the very policy in the first place. Free higher education dates back even beyond the Freedom Charter. It comes into the RDP document. It comes into the Polokwane, Mangaung, Nazareth resolutions, and Nazareth again in the form of conference. You remember, for example, some people were saying the announced policy by President Jacob Zuma is against ANC policy. You would ask yourself, but which ANC policy are they talking about? But anyway, in a matter of days, the very same conference reaffirmed the announcement and instructed government to implement it immediately. So that's what I'm saying. Let's stay far from the politics.
Are you not interested to know why some cabinet ministers sort of evaded free education?
Me? No, not that far from it. If anything, really, I am not... I'll tell you why I even take interviews in the first place. Is because there was a growing narrative by those who benefit from the current multi-billion rand loan scheme to try and derail the implementation of, or the smooth implementation of free higher education in order to prove that it is not feasible. That is why I believe all young people had to defend free higher education. And I will tell you why. You see, the South African government is largely run by consultants. Most departments, consult on almost everything. But these consultants are not neutral in their opinions. In fact, if their primary clients are in the private sector, it is almost against their own practices to recommend a policy that would destroy a market for their initial clients. That is why, the South African government must really think deeper when we go past this funding issue to say, how does NSFAS produce thousands of graduates? Can account for them. Those thousands of graduates go and work for consulting companies, and then the very government goes and buy consulting services, and they are sold back their own graduates. Yeah. There are many things that are wrong with the current configuration of the South African economy in relation to higher education. And I think those substantive matters should be what matters. Who says what, when, how? I really want to stay as far away from the petty politics as possible because I'm a researcher, not a political analyst. In fact, much of the surface interpretation of free education are coming from political analysts. Some of them would say, how can a government afford free education for 90% of students? It's not 90% of students. It's 90% of South African households. But because of the inequality inherent in higher education in South Africa, children of the bottom 90% of South African households contribute or constitute a mere 45% of the overall student population. The uglier way of saying that is that children of the top 10% earning South African households constitute 55% of the student population. And those of the bottom 90% are cramped up in historically black, highly under-resourced universities, while children of the top 10% South African households, amongst whom 95% of our wealth reside, are in elite institutions. That's why, for example, if you take the 980,000 odd students in our universities, they can be broken down into 300,000 students in UNISA, 300,000 students in historically black universities and universities of technology, and the remaining 300,000 in elite institutions. So in other words, elite universities like Stellenbosch, Wits, and so on constitute just about above 30% of the student population, but their cost is almost 50% of the overall funding required for the whole sector. Right. So we need to go deeper and question the anatomy of the full cost of study. When
we're fast running out of time,
no problem.
But I want you to say, for a student watching this interview at home,
yes,
a poor student potentially who has the desire to enter university, what do you have to say to them?
Well, firstly, results have been uploaded onto the university systems.
Yeah.
But some universities will still require you to submit your matric certificate. So if you get an SMS to say you have a provisional or a firm offer, please submit your certificate or statement of results. Yeah. Please make sure you do so immediately, because if you spend 3 or 4 days without doing so, your space is given to someone else. But number two, free higher education is very, the only thing that has changed is that NSFAS is no longer dishing out loans, it's dishing out grants, that's all. So nothing has changed. Those who applied to university and have a firm offer, and I come from the threshold of between 0 and 350,000 and applied for NSFAS. NSFAS letter is what you will use to register to do everything. Right. But if you never applied for NSFAS but received a firm offer from university, I heard NSFAS saying that they will not reopen the application, but they will assist and consider students who have a firm offer from a university but did not apply because they didn't know there would be free education. So, and of course, late applications are open at some institutions online, but it's not a sectoral matter. You need to understand institution by institution, and of course, from there onwards, once you've got your letter of award, you use it to buy books and do everything else.
Thank you, Mr. Masuta.
Thank you.
We're fast out of time, but I'd like to extend this interview another time. I think you've been a great help to students.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's been a privilege to have you. I won't ask why News 24 reported that you are a spy for state security.
You can. They are confusing crime intelligence with economic
intelligence. That's another matter
intelligence.
altogether, for another night, but you've been a great help.
No problem. But you can ask me anything.
Yeah, you've been a great guest.
Sharp.
Yeah. And we're out of time. I want to thank my guest, Mr. Masuta, for coming through and speaking on free decolonized education. I am Sifiso Mahlangu. This is Straight Talk, channel 405 on DSTV, every Sunday at 7 p.m. Pray for South Africa. That's a good night from me.